Hi, I'm David Wovrash, attorney with the Legal Aid Society of Cincinnati's Low Income Taxpayer Clinic, and I'm here today to share some recent developments that could result in more money being refunded to you or the amount that you owe the IRS being reduced. A recent tax court case held that many people were charged interest and penalties on their filings during the pandemic but should not have been. In this video, we'll discuss how to request relief if you are still being charged for these penalties and interest. This is very time sensitive, so you'll need to act fast. Of course, if you have any questions, go ahead and type those questions into the chat and we'll answer them along the way. Most people know that tax returns are due by April 15th each year. If you don't file a return and pay what's owed by that date, the IRS can charge penalties and interest on the amount due. However, the United States Tax Court recently made an important ruling that impacts tens of millions of people. That case held that COVID-era rules extended the deadline to file returns during the pandemic. Now, that ruling means that the IRS incorrectly charged penalties and interest on late filed returns during the pandemic. Those people who were charged penalties and interest may be entitled to a refund or a reduction in those penalties. But this reduction or refund does not happen automatically. This case is currently being appealed, so it's not yet final. Even while this is still being appealed, taxpayers who are impacted by this ruling will need to act fast. So what exactly was the ruling and why is it so important? Well, the federal government recognized that COVID-19 was a threat and declared a federal disaster that legally ran from January 20th, 2020 through May 11th, 2023. The court ruled that the tax filing deadline and the deadline to pay those taxes were paused until the end of the disaster, plus an extra 60 days, bringing that deadline to July 10th, 2023. So why does this matter? Well, during this period, the IRS still considered any return filed after the normal filing deadline late. As a result, the IRS charged penalties and interest on those returns that continued to accrue during the disaster period. Now, the recent ruling held that because the filing deadline was paused, those penalties and interest should not have been charged at all. This means that the millions of taxpayers who were charged penalties and interest are entitled to have them refunded or reduced. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen automatically, and taxpayers have to either request an abatement or file a refund claim. Today, we're covering abatements. We'll discuss how to do this in a minute, but first, how do you know if you've been impacted? So generally, if you were assessed penalties and interest for late filed returns between January 20th, 2020 and July 10th, 2023, this decision may apply to you. Taxpayers who were charged interest and penalties during this period need to file a protective claim. If you already paid the penalties and fees, you will need to file a request for a refund. If the protective claim for a refund is not postmarked by July 10th, 2026, you might lose your right to request a refund forever. Now, we'll discuss that process in our next video. If you didn't pay the penalties and interest and you are still being charged, you should request a penalty abatement. While the abatement can be requested after the July 10th, 2026 deadline, it is still best to file as soon as possible. So if you think this applies to you, it's best to double check. To do this, you will want to check your IRS transcripts. You can call the IRS to request an account transcript. To do it faster, you can create an online IRS account and request an account transcript online. Of course, we're putting a link in the chat to the IRS account portal. Next, you'll want to pull your account transcripts from 2019 through 2022. That's because these are the transcripts that have that correct date range. Look for penalties and interest charged between January 20th, 2020 and July 10th, 2023. If you were charged, you should file a protective claim. A protective claim is simply a placeholder that lets the IRS know you're requesting that they remove the interest and penalties while the law is still being decided by the court. So how do you go ahead and file that protective claim? First, you need to use an IRS Form 843 for each tax year you're requesting the penalty abatement. Of course, we're dropping a link to this form in the chat. Next, write protective refund claim pursuant to Quong clearly across the top of the form. Fill out the form with as much detail as possible. Include the year that you're asking for the abatement, and include whether it is for penalty or interest. Because this is only a protective claim, you don't need the exact amount of penalty or interest on the form. Finally, mail that form into the IRS to the address that you mail your tax return to. We're dropping a link in the chat so you can find that location. Now, it's recommended that you file the request for penalty abatement as soon as possible. And you should send that Form 843 through certified mail so that you can prove when you mailed it and you can prove that the IRS actually received it. And once the tax court case is resolved, the IRS can then act on the protected claims. This can be a long process and it can actually take years, but it's important to get that claim in now. And of course, this is a developing issue, so stay tuned for more information. And remember, if you're in need of professional assistance for a tax matter with the IRS, you may be eligible for legal representation through a low-income taxpayer clinic in your area. We're dropping a map of the low-income taxpayer clinics all throughout Ohio in the chat so that you can find the LITC that serves your area. That's all for now.